What happens when the lowest servant in a savage pack harbors a secret that could destroy an empire? She spent 19 years scrubbing floors, branded as a wolfless failure. But when the ruthless Alpha King caught a single glimpse of her scarred collarbone, the entire kingdom fell to its knees. The stone floors of the High Ridge Keep were mercilessly cold, especially in the dead of winter. For Isolde, the chill was a constant companion, settling deep into her bones as she scrubbed the ancient flagstones with hands chapped raw by lye and freezing water. She was 20 years old, an age when every werewolf in the pack should have long since shifted, found their rank and taken their place in the hierarchy. Isolde, however, had never shifted. In the brutal society of the High Ridge Pack, a wolfless girl was worse than human. She was a genetic failure, a walking insult to the moon goddess. Her father, a lowly guard named Thomas, who had perished in a border skirmish years ago, had left her with nothing but his meager debts and a strange, jagged birthmark on her left collarbone. The pack's Alpha Lord Garrett had graciously allowed her to stay not out of kindness, but because free labor was always welcome in a keep that required constant upkeep. "You missed a spot, Mutt." Isolde didn't need to look up to recognize the sneer in the voice. It belonged to Cordelia Alpha Garrett's only daughter. Cordelia was a striking, golden-furred wolf in her shifted form, and a stunning, cruel woman in her human one. She wore a heavy velvet gown trimmed with white fox fur, a stark contrast to Isolde's ragged, ash-stained linen tunic. Before Isolde could reach out to scrub the imaginary spot, Cordelia's heavy leather riding boot kicked the wooden bucket. Dirty, icy water flooded across the stones Isolde had just spent 2 hours cleaning, soaking instantly into the knees of her thin trousers. "Clean it again," Cordelia ordered, her voice echoing in the cavernous dining hall. "And do it quickly. My father expects the great hall to shine. King Alistair arrives by nightfall, and if he smells so much as a hint of your filthy, unshifted scent, I will have the guards throw you out into the snow to freeze." Isolde kept her head bowed, her wet hair clinging to her pale cheeks. "Yes, Lady Cordelia," she murmured, her voice raspy from disuse. As Cordelia sauntered away, her laughter echoing off the high vaulted ceilings, Isolde pressed a trembling wet hand against her left collarbone. Right where the water had splashed her skin, a searing heat began to pulse. It was the mark. It always burned when her emotions ran high, when the humiliation threatened to choke her, or when the sheer injustice of her life made her vision blur. The mark was shaped strangely, like a crescent moon pierced by a dual-bladed sword. The pack healer, an old woman named Margaret, had once taken one look at it, when Isolde was an infant, turned pale, and declared it a devil's brand. Since then, Isolde had kept it hidden beneath high-collared tunics and thick scarves. Tonight was the most important night in the history of High Ridge. King Alistair of the Northern Dominion, the Alpha King himself, was conducting a royal tour of his territories. Alistair was a legend, wrapped in bloodshed. It was whispered that he had decimated 3 rogue packs single-handedly, that his wolf was the size of a warhorse, and that his eyes were the color of burning amber. But the most prominent rumor, the one that had the noblewomen of every pack in a frenzy, was that the king was approaching 30, and still had not found his fated mate. Without a mate, an Alpha King's inner beast would eventually consume his humanity, driving him to madness. Lord Garrett's plan was entirely transparent. He intended to parade Cordelia in front of the king, hoping her beauty and strong pedigree would be enough to tempt Alistair into taking her as his chosen mate, even if she wasn't fated by the goddess. Isolde. The sharp bark of the head cook. Beatrice broke through her thoughts. Beatrice was a stout, no-nonsense woman with a permanent scowl. "Stop staring at the puddles and get to the kitchens. Lord Reginald has sent a dozen pheasants that need plucking before dusk, and the king's outriders have already been spotted at the Valley Pass. Isolde scrambled to her feet, ignoring the aching protest of her cold joints, and hurried toward the servants' quarters. She was to remain entirely out of sight tonight. Lord Garrett had been explicitly clear the king was not to know that the High Ridge pack harbored a dud. Isolde was a stain on their pristine reputation. As the sun dipped below the jagged mountain peaks, casting long, bloody shadows across the snow, the heavy iron gates of the keep shrieked open. From the tiny window in the scullery, Isolde peeked out her breath, fogging the frosty glass. A procession of massive armoured riders rode into the courtyard on horseback, their cloaks snapping in the bitter wind. At the centre of the formation rode a man who seemed to swallow the light around him. He was terrifyingly broad-shouldered, draped in midnight black pelts. Even from this distance, the sheer, crushing weight of his aura pressed against the castle walls. Isolde gasped, stumbling back from the window, as a heavy, intoxicating scent, pine needles, crackling ozone, and fresh rain suddenly flooded her senses, overriding the smell of roasting meat and damp firewood. Her collarbone flared with agonizing heat. Isolde collapsed against the wooden counter, tearing at the collar of her tunic, panting, as the strange sword and crescent mark glowed with a faint, unnatural silver light. The Alpha King had arrived. The great hall of High Ridge was a spectacle of medieval decadence. Tapestries of legendary hunts hung from the walls, illuminated by hundreds of beeswax candles that cast a warm, flickering glow over the long oak tables. The air was thick with the scent of roasted venison-spiced wine and the nervous, eager pheromones of the pack's elite. At the high table, Lord Garrett sat beside his distinguished guest. King Alistair was even more intimidating up close. He didn't eat. He barely drank. He sat perfectly still, his jaw clenched, his amber eyes scanning the room with the predatory boredom of a lion watching a flock of sheep. He radiated a suppressed, violent energy. Next to him, Cordelia was doing everything in her power to capture his attention, leaning close to pour his wine, her laughter loud and artificial. Our lands extend past the whispering woods. Your Grace. Lord Garrett was boasting his face, flushed with wine. We have bred the finest warriors in the region. My daughter Cordelia personally trains the vanguard. Alistair slowly turned his gaze to Cordelia. His expression was completely unreadable. Is that so? He murmured. His voice was a deep, gravelly rumble that sent involuntary shivers down the spines of everyone within earshot. It held no warmth, only a terrifying edge of command. Deep in the bowels of the keep, the kitchen was in absolute chaos. "The main course!" Beatrice screamed, her face purple with stress. "Where is the roasted boar? The king is waiting." Both of the serving boys collapsed from the heat of the ovens. Beatrice, a panicked maid, cried out, "The platter is too heavy for the girls." Beatrice's wild eyes darted around the room and landed on Isolde, who was huddled in the corner, desperately trying to ignore the burning sensation in her chest that had only grown more intense over the last hour. "You." Beatrice pointed a meaty finger at Isolde. "Get up. Take the silver platter. Carry it to the high table immediately." "But Lord Garrett forbade me from entering the hall." Isolde stammered, her eyes widening in terror. "Lord Garrett will have my head on a spike if the king is kept waiting for his meat," Beatrice roared, shoving Isolde toward the massive silver tray holding a whole roasted boar surrounded by root vegetables. "Take it, keep your head down, serve it, and get out." With trembling hands, Isolde gripped the handles of the heavy silver platter. It took every ounce of her strength to lift it. As she pushed through the heavy swinging doors and stepped into the grand hall, the noise of the banquet washed over her. But it wasn't the noise that stopped her in her tracks. It was the scent. The pine and ozone smell was so concentrated here that it made Isolde's head spin. Her vision narrowed. Her heart hammered violently against her ribs. She kept her head down, her ragged hair falling over her face, praying she would be invisible as she hurried toward the high table. Cordelia was in the middle of a charming anecdote about a recent hunt when she saw Isolde approaching. Her golden eyes narrowed into slits of pure fury. How dare this useless mutt show her face in the king's presence? Lord Garrett also spotted her, and the colour drained completely from his face. Isolde reached the steps leading up to the high table. She just needed to place the platter down and retreat. Just 5 more steps. Cordelia, furious that the king's gaze had briefly flickered away from her, made a split-second malicious decision. As Isolde passed behind her chair to reach the serving stand, Cordelia smoothly kicked her leg out, catching Isolde's ankle. Isolde pitched forward. Time seemed to slow down. The massive silver platter slipped from her grasp, crashing onto the stone floor with an ear-splitting clang that silenced the entire hall. The roasted boar rolled across the dais grease and gravy, splashing violently across the hem of Cordelia's pristine white gown. A collective gasp sucked the air from the room. "You clumsy, worthless wretch!" Cordelia shrieked, leaping to her feet. "Look what you've done to my dress!" Lord Garrett stood up, his face twisted in absolute rage. "Guards, seize her. Take her to the courtyard and prepare the whip." 2 heavily armored guards instantly stepped forward. One of them, a brute named Holden, grabbed Isolde roughly by the back of her tunic, yanking her up from the puddle of grease. Isolde choked, struggling to breathe as the fabric tightened around her throat. In his rough handling, the cheap, rotted fabric of her collar gave way. "Ripe." The tunic tore down the front, exposing Isolde's left shoulder and collarbone to the open air. At that exact moment, the glowing silver mark on her skin pulsed with blinding intensity, a perfect crescent moon pierced by a dual-bladed sword. A sudden suffocating silence slammed into the hall. It was a silence so profound, so heavy, that people felt the air being crushed out of their lungs. King Alistair froze. The wine glass he was holding shattered in his hand, the shards biting into his palm, red wine, and blood dripping onto the white tablecloth. His amber eyes locked onto the glowing mark on Isolde's pale skin. His nostrils flared, taking in the scent he had been waiting a century to find, not the scent of a weak human, but the ancient, overwhelming fragrance of starlight and winter roses. Holden, oblivious to the king, shook Isolde. "Come on, mutt." A low, guttural snarl ripped through the hall, a sound so terrifying and inhuman that several nobles dropped to their knees in immediate instinctual submission. King Alistair vaulted over the heavy oak table, moving with a speed impossible for a man of his size. Before Holden could blink, the Alpha King's massive hand clamped around the guard's armored throat. With a flick of his wrist, Alistair threw the 200-pound guard 30 feet across the room, where he smashed into a stone pillar and crumpled unconscious. The entire hall erupted into panic, but no one dared move. Lord Garrett stood, paralyzed, trembling uncontrollably. Alistair didn't look at Garrett. He didn't look at the screaming Cordelia. He slowly dropped to one knee amidst the spilled wine grease and ruined food right in front of the terrified, trembling servant girl. Isolde shrank back, expecting a blow, but the king's massive, blood-stained hands gently reached out, trembling slightly, as his fingers brushed the ragged edge of her torn tunic, tracing the air just millimeters above the glowing mark. The royal crest of the first Lycans, the mark of the true queen. Alistair looked up, his amber eyes swirling with an emotion so raw and possessive it made Isolde gasp. "Who did this to you?" the Alpha King whispered, his voice shaking the very foundations of the keep. He slowly turned his head to glare at Lord Garrett and Cordelia, his eyes now glowing a demonic, lethal gold. "Who dared to enslave my mate?" The silence in the great hall was a physical weight thick enough to choke on. Lord Garrett's face had drained of all colour, leaving him looking like a corpse propped up in fine velvet. Cordelia remained frozen, her mouth slightly ajar, the spilled wine and boar grease seeping unnoticed into the heavy fabric of her ruined gown. "Your Grace!" Lord Garrett finally stammered, his voice cracking. He wiped a bead of cold sweat from his forehead. There must be some misunderstanding. That creature is a dud, a wolfless servant. She is entirely beneath your notice, a genetic failure." Before Garrett could finish his sentence, King Alistair stood up. He didn't shout, he didn't roar. He simply unclasped the heavy midnight black dire wolf pelt from his own shoulders and wrapped it gently around Isolde, covering her exposed skin and the glowing silver mark. The pelt was impossibly warm, smelling deeply of his intoxicating scent, pine ozone, and a raw, untamed power. "Commander Harrison!" Alistair spoke, his voice low, yet carrying effortlessly to every corner of the terrified room. A massive warrior stepped out from the shadows of the king's retinue. His armor gleamed in the candlelight. "Yes, my king. Secure the perimeter of the keep. No one leaves. If Lord Garrett or his daughter attempt to step foot outside this hall, break their legs." Alistair's amber eyes flicked back to the trembling lord. "You will answer for every drop of blood, every bruise, and every tear my mate has shed in your wretched household. Pray to the goddess that she is merciful, Garrett, because I am not." Isolde was trembling so violently her teeth chattered. The shock of the evening, the sudden violence, the revelation, the overwhelming presence of the king was too much for a body weakened by years of malnutrition and grueling labor. Her knees finally buckled. Alistair caught her before she hit the stone floor. He lifted her into his arms as easily as if she weighed nothing at all. Pressing her face into his chest, he carried her out of the great hall, leaving the high nobility of the High Ridge pack shivering under the drawn swords of the royal vanguard. He took her directly to the Alpha's private wing, Garrett's own chambers, kicking the heavy oak doors open with a single resounding strike of his boot. He laid her gently onto the massive four-poster bed, stepping back only to allow his royal physician, an older woman named Dr. Penelope, to approach. "She is burning up, Penelope?" Alistair said, his voice completely stripped of its previous menace, replaced by a desperate, frantic edge. Her mark was glowing. "But I cannot sense her wolf. It's as if she is entirely empty inside. How is that possible for the bearer of the first lichen crestwaxuk?" "Doctor." Penelope opened her leather satchel and withdrew a series of silver vials. "Let me examine her, your grace. The mark never lies. If the goddess branded her, the wolf is there." For the next hour, Isolde lay in a daze, wrapped in the king's cloak, answering Dr. Penelope's gentle questions, while Alistair paced the room like a caged beast. Penelope drew a small vial of blood from Isolde's arm, mixing it with a strange, luminescent blue liquid. Suddenly, the mixture in the vial hissed and turned a violently dark shade of purple. Penelope gasped, dropping the vial into a silver basin where it smoked and bubbled. She turned to Alistair, her face tight with fury. "My king! She is not a dud. She has been systematically poisoned." Isolde blinked her mind, struggling to process the words. "Poisoned," she whispered, her raspy voice breaking. "But I've only ever eaten the scraps from the kitchen." "Silver ash root," Penelope explained, holding up a cloth over her nose to avoid the fumes of the ruined blood. "It is a highly illegal ancient botanical. When ingested in small daily doses over a lifetime, it binds to a werewolf's nervous system. It suppresses the inner beast, preventing the shift and making the victim appear wolfless. The agony you feel in your joints, the coldness in your blood. It isn't weakness, Isolde. It's your wolf trapped in a cage of poison, screaming to get out. Alistair stopped pacing. The heavy wooden bedpost he was holding splintered into kindling under his grip. "Who was her father?" he demanded. "Thomas," Isolde whispered. "He was just a guard. He died when I was a baby." "He was no guard," Penelope said softly, examining the intricate details of the mark on Isolde's collarbone. "This mark belongs to the lost royal house of the White Moon. They were massacred 20 years ago by a rival pack. Lord Garrett claimed he arrived too late to save them, annexing their lands into his own territory. He must have recognized you as the sole surviving heir. Instead of killing you and risking the wrath of the moon goddess, he poisoned you and made you a slave in your own ancestral home." Tears streamed down Isolde's face. 19 years of beatings. 19 years of scrubbing floors on her hands and knees. 19 years of believing she was defective, an insult to her species. All of it was a lie designed to steal her birthright. Alistair knelt by the bed, taking her rough, blistered hands in his massive ones. He pressed a gentle kiss to her knuckles. "The poison ends tonight." He vowed, his amber eyes burning with a terrifying, beautiful promise. "I will tear this keep down stone by stone, and I will build you a throne from the rubble." 2 days passed. Under Doctor Penelope's intensive care, the remaining silver ash poison was slowly purged from Isolde's system through a series of grueling, agonizing herbal treatments. With every hour that passed, Isolde felt a strange, terrifying pressure building in her chest. It was a heartbeat that did not belong to her human body, a wild, restless drumming that echoed in her ears. Alistair rarely left her side, tending to her fevers with cool cloths and speaking to her in low, soothing murmurs. For the first time in her life, Isolde felt safe. But the calm was merely the eye of a devastating storm. Down in the holding cells, Cordelia was losing her mind. Stripped of her silks and locked in a cold stone room, the pampered Alpha's daughter was consumed by a blinding, venomous hatred. She refused to accept that the throne she had coveted her entire life had been stolen by the very creature she had used as a footstool. Using the last of her hidden jewelry, Cordelia bribed a disgruntled night guard named William. William had long resented the royal vanguard's intrusion and was easily swayed by Cordelia's promises of immense wealth and a high-ranking position once the usurper king left. "The king is under a blood spell," Cordelia hissed through the iron bars, her golden eyes wild and sunken. "That filthy mutt used dark magic to mimic a mate bond. If you kill her, the spell breaks. The king will come to his senses and realize I am his true match. Give me a weapon, William. Let me into her chambers while the king is interrogating my father." William, blinded by greed, agreed. At midnight, while Alistair was deep in the dungeons, extracting a full confession from Lord Garrett, William unlocked Cordelia's cell. He handed her a hunting dagger. The blade glistened with a thick, viscous paste-liquid wolfsbane, fatal to any lichen. They used the hidden servant passages, the very tunnels Isolde had spent years scrubbing, to bypass Commander Harrison's guards. They emerged quietly in the shadows of the royal bedchamber. Isolde was alone, standing by the large, arched window, looking out over the snow-covered mountains. She felt restless. The pressure in her chest had grown into a roaring inferno. "Enjoying the view, mutt?" Isolde spun around. Cordelia stepped out of the shadows, the wolfsbane-coated dagger gripped tightly in her hand. William stood by the door, locking it from the inside. "Cordelia," Isolde gasped, stepping back. "You shouldn't be here." "I shouldn't be here." Cordelia laughed, a hysterical grating sound. "This is my home. You are nothing but a scrub, a filthy floor washer. You think putting on a royal cloak makes you a queen. You'll always be a pathetic, wolfless dud." Cordelia lunged. Isolde raised her arms to defend herself, but she was still weak from the purging process. The blade slashed her forearm. The burning agony of the wolfsbane was instantaneous, sending fire racing up her veins. Isolde cried out, stumbling backward and crashing into the dressing table. Glass shattered across the stone floor. "Hold her down, William!" Cordelia shrieked, raising the dagger for a lethal strike to Isolde's chest. William rushed forward, grabbing Isolde by the hair and slamming her to her knees amidst the broken glass. Isolde looked up at the descending blade, her heart hammering in her throat. No, the thought wasn't a whisper. It was a roar. For 19 years she had submitted. She had bowed her head, taken the beatings, and swallowed the humiliation. But the poison was gone, and the creature that had been locked inside the dark, suffocating cage of her mind was finally awake, and it was absolutely furious. The silver mark on Isolde's collarbone didn't just glow, it erupted with blinding, incandescent light, illuminating the dark chamber like a fallen star. Crack! The sound of Isolde's spine realigning echoed through the room like a gunshot. William screamed, letting go of her hair as his hands were scorched by the sheer heat radiating from her body. "Kill her!" Cordelia screamed, stabbing downward, but the blade never connected. Isolde's hand shot up, catching Cordelia's wrist with bone-crushing force. Isolde's eyes, once a dull, submissive brown, were now glowing, a brilliant, terrifying silver. In a violent, breathtaking explosion of power, Isolde shifted. There was no awkward transition, no fumbling first change. The transformation was instantaneous and flawless. Where the ragged servant girl had knelt, a monster of myth now stood. She was an enormous, ethereal wolf, standing almost 7 feet tall at the shoulder. Her fur was a pure, blinding silver, shimmering with an otherworldly luminescence. The ancient royal bloodline of the White Moon had returned. The silver wolf let out a deafening roar, a sound that shattered the remaining windows and shook the very foundation of the keep. William tried to run, but with a single swipe of her massive paw, Isolde sent him flying into the stone wall, knocking him unconscious instantly. Cordelia backed away, dropping the dagger, her face paralyzed with absolute terror. The golden-furred alpha's daughter suddenly looked like a fragile, insignificant mouse before a god. The silver wolf stalked forward, her jaws snapping shut inches from Cordelia's face, a low growl vibrating through the floorboards. The chamber doors suddenly exploded inward, blown completely off their iron hinges. King Alistair burst into the room, his eyes glowing amber, his claws fully extended, ready to slaughter whoever had dared attack his mate. But he froze in his tracks. He stared at the magnificent silver beast standing protectively over the cowering Cordelia. The raw power radiating from Isolde forced Alistair's inner wolf forward. Slowly the terrifying Alpha King lowered his head and dropped to one knee, partially shifting to expose his own throat in a display of absolute submission and reverence to his equal. Isolde turned her massive silver head toward him. The wild, violent energy in the room softened. She padded forward, her giant paws silent on the stone, and pressed her large, wet nose against Alistair's cheek, accepting her king. The following morning, High Ridge was a pack reborn. Lord Garrett and Cordelia, stripped of their titles, and their wolves bound by royal decree, were banished to the frozen wastelands, forever exiled from the territories they had stolen. Isolde did not return to the scullery. Dressed in a gown of midnight blue and silver, With the Alpha King firmly at her side, she stepped out onto the highest balcony of the keep. Below her, the thousands of wolves of the Northern Dominion bowed their heads, not out of fear, but out of absolute loyalty. The wolfless servant was dead. Long live the White Moon Queen. And that is the epic tale of Isolde the Outcast who claimed her rightful throne. Her journey proves that true power can never be hidden forever. Did you love this thrilling werewolf romance drama? Let us know your favorite plot twist in the comments. Don't forget to hit that like button, share this video with your friends, and subscribe to our channel for more amazing audio stories.